Anyone interested in the fate of the princes in the tower quickly places Elizabeth Woodville at the center of their considerations. The questions are always the same. Did the mother of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury believe her sons were dead? Or did she think that her children might still be alive? And if Elizabeth Woodville believed the princes had died, whom did she blame? Over the centuries, practically every conceivable answer to these questions has been offered at one time or another. This is primarily because no direct statements from the Queen of Edward IV have survived. Originally, I had no intention of working on this topic, for we are forced to rely on assumptions, plausible though they may be, to compensate for the lack of clear testimony. Contradiction is inevitable. What convinced me to address the subject were two maps, one historical, the other modern. The older map marks Bermondsey Street, while the newer one highlights the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, which once stood right beside Bermondsey Abbey. Elizabeth Woodville chose to retire in a place from which she could see the Tower of London every day. I even did the calculations. Apart from rare weather phenomena such as heavy fog, she would have been able to make out at least the towers of the White Tower daily. This was despite her refusal ever again to set foot inside the fortress for the rest of her life, even on occasions when such a visit was expected of her. I can already anticipate the first objection to this point, so I will address it shortly. But before that, a greeting is in order. Welcome or welcome back to Lemmy History. In the past few weeks, I have already published several videos about Elizabeth Woodville, Bermondsey Abbey, and the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion. In those, I argue that she moved to the convent of her own volition. The videos with the detailed arguments and explanations are linked in the description. In short, Elizabeth Woodville had rented her accommodation at the convent long before the rebellion broke out. At that time, she still had full control over her property. Other contradictions I anticipate involve Philippa Langley's project, which claimed that Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury survived and that the pretenders Lambert-Simnel and Perkin Warbeck were in fact the princes. I have probably engaged with Langley's findings more than most historians. I am linking to my video in which I explain why I believe Perkin Warbeck was an impostor and why Lambert-Simnel was not Edward V. Constructive objections are always welcome. Langley, however, has only demonstrated that there existed at least one man who pretended to be one of the princes in the tower, namely Warbeck. But this was already well known. What she did not prove is that Warbeck was truly one of the princes. On the contrary, the sources she uncovered differ so drastically from the known testimonies linked to Warbeck that her conclusions raise serious questions of credibility. As for Simnel, Langley's assumptions scarcely merit serious consideration. She fails even once to connect him specifically with Edward V. Further contradictions may arise from Ricardian circles and their alternative theories. For example, there exists a Tyrrell family story claiming that the princes and Elizabeth Woodville spent some time in the Tyrrell home after the summer of 1483. David Baldwin, meanwhile, advances the so-called Colchester connection, according to which Richard of Shrewsbury stayed for several months with Francis Lovell before Bosworth, and then left the country with Henry's knowledge and blessing. The only basis for this theory is the fact that the new king did not immediately pursue Lovell, even though William Catesby was executed straight after the battle. Yet no mention is made of the obvious explanation: the difference in status between the two men, and the fact that Lovell was related by marriage to Elizabeth of York through his wife. Baldwin goes so far as to suggest that Richard of Shrewsbury watched the Battle of Bosworth together with Lovell, attributing this claim to Henry's hesitation. While imaginative, this is hardly reliable historical scholarship. I can only ask for your trust when I say that I'm familiar with these theories, but they are so implausible that I cannot give them weight. And just to anticipate another objection, There will doubtless also be comments accusing Henry VII and Margaret Beaufort of murdering the princes. Yet we are also supposed to believe that this Tudor king spared his adversary's closest friend, and even one of the princes themselves. That is simply untenable. Over the centuries, Ricardians have spun a jumble of theories that have taken on lives of their own, divorced from reality. For example, one often reads that Edward V suffered pain when chewing during his time in the Tower, supposedly reported by John Argentine. Yet we have only one account of Argentine preserved by Mancini, and it refers solely to the young king's inner life. The story of physical ailments comes instead from George Buck, who believed the princes had died of natural causes, since their sisters also died young. When bones were discovered beneath a staircase in the White Tower in 1674, this was transformed into a supposed jaw disease of Edward V. Ironically, many proponents of this theory also insist that the bones were not those of the princes at all. I am always open to learning. Anyone who can provide me with suitable primary sources confirming such claims will have my sincere gratitude. In this video, I will also present a counter-argument to the notion that Elizabeth Woodville believed her sons survived. At the very end of this video, I will share and explain my own conclusion. It is important to emphasize that this video is not about the question of whether Richard actually killed the princes. Even if Elizabeth Woodville almost certainly believed he had, that does not prove he did. Our focus today is solely on what she herself thought about the fate of her sons. To keep the discussion clear and manageable, I will remain focused on Elizabeth Woodville, ideally relying only on testimonies from the years when she was still alive. However, this brings me back to the central problem. As far as we know, Elizabeth Woodville never directly addressed the fate of the princes. In general, very few of her writings have survived. The existing letters come from her time as queen, and we know there were other documents from her hand that would be of great value to us, though these are now lost. It is well known, for example, that she corresponded with Margaret Beaufort while in sanctuary at Westminster. From the early Tudor period, the only extended text we still possess is Elizabeth Woodville's will. I will show it on the screen. In it, she makes no mention of the princes. She names only two of her children explicitly: her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, and her eldest, and perhaps only surviving, son Thomas Grey. At one point, she refers generally to her children. Theoretically, the princes might be included here, but it is more likely she meant her other daughters. Without even considering the princes, it is certain that Elizabeth Woodville had lost several children: Mary, Margaret, George, and Richard Grey. None of them are named in the will. For this reason, many in the past have argued that the omission of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury shows she believed them dead. But I find this interpretation too strong. A will is a practical document intended to ensure the execution of one's final wishes, and it addresses above all those responsible for carrying them out. Another notable absence is Henry VII. It might reasonably be expected that Elizabeth would have acknowledged him, at least in the opening of the document, by mentioning his regnal year. Yet she does not. In the past, this omission has often been taken as evidence of a broken relationship between her and the new Tudor king. Some have even read it as a silent indictment of him for the prince's fate. Personally, I do not think this is the case. Much more likely, it reflects her choice of self-presentation. She explicitly styles herself Queen of England again in the text, and Henry was not her husband. The Tudors may well have wished for a different formulation, but in my view, this actually strengthens the authenticity of the document. We are reading Elizabeth Woodville's genuine last testament, unaltered. Her self-designation as queen also shows her awareness that this will would be widely known. When she invokes God's blessing for her daughter and all her descendants, this may be interpreted indirectly as recognition of the Tudor dynasty. But once again, Henry himself remains unmentioned. With her will, Elizabeth Woodville does not easily open a window into her soul. Instead, we find one last expression of the pride she felt as the wife and queen of Edward IV. At the same time, the letter reveals her deep piety, above all her devotion to the Virgin Mary. Some passages, particularly those concerning her small possessions, can be read as a veiled accusation. But that need not be the case. Elizabeth Woodville had long felt a strong connection to the Carthusian order. As early as the second half of the 1470s, she obtained a license permitting her to attend all Carthusian masses throughout England. John Ingleby, named in the will, belonged to the order. The Carthusians, tracing their foundation back to Bruno of Cologne, emphasized the supremacy of the spiritual life over material wealth. Their ideal was to live in peace, detached from worldly concerns. The Charterhouse at Avignon became famous for its motto, "Dead to the world in order to open oneself completely to God." Her brother Anthony Woodville also felt close to the Carthusians' ideals. Given his strong influence on Edward V during their years together in Wales, it is quite possible that the elder prince had direct exposure to the order's values. The few testimonies we possess about him point in this direction. One account, reported by Argentine, became legendary. Edward repented daily while in the Tower, convinced his death was near. The Carthusians placed immense emphasis on penance and asceticism as paths to God. Anthony himself wore a rough hair shirt as a permanent form of penance. I consider Argentine's account of Edward authentic, though I would link it above all to the religious influence of his mother and uncle. As for Elizabeth Woodville herself, Bermondsey was a Benedictine monastery. The Benedictine rule has always combined prayer and work, and since the 10th century it placed particular importance on monastic poverty. Thus, the modesty reflected in the will may not be an accusation at all, but rather a deliberate embrace of this ideal. Overall, her testament reflects a prioritization of spiritual over worldly life. My reading is this: Elizabeth Woodville wished to be remembered as a devout Christian, a queen, and a mother. As for her sons, she could only hope that God, in his mercy, would care for them, both in this world and in the next. Regardless of the boys' actual fate, their mother was most likely concerned above all with their closeness to God. For us, this is unsatisfying, but for Elizabeth Woodville, it was the only consolation available. If we want more concrete insights into her thoughts on the princes in the Tower, we must turn to indirect sources that concern the former queen and may allow us to draw conclusions about her sons. One such source may be found as early as the reign of Richard III. At that time, William Caxton translated and printed numerous books, strongly supported by the Woodvilles. He often composed his own prologues and epilogues, which typically included a dedication to the patron who had commissioned the work. For example, in 1483, he dedicated a book to William, Earl of Arundel. In one case, however, the dedication is anonymous. Caxton speaks only of a noble lady, wife of a noble lord, who had many noble daughters. It is generally assumed that this refers to Elizabeth Woodville and her daughters. But the question remains, why did Caxton not name them directly? The dates of completion and printing are revealing. Caxton finished the translation on the 1st of June 1483, at which point Elizabeth Woodville and her family had already been in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey for a month. Yet the work was not printed until the 31st of January 1484, when the family was still in sanctuary. The difference between those two moments is striking. On the 1st of June 1483, Elizabeth still had Richard of Shrewsbury with her. By the 31st of January 1484, he had vanished into the Tower and had not been seen for a long time. In addition to the book's character as a guide for the upbringing of daughters, this change could explain why Caxton's prologue speaks only of daughters. He wrote the prologue after the disappearance of the boys. At the time of printing, Richard III's only Parliament was also in session. There it was declared that Elizabeth's daughters were illegitimate, since Richard's claim to the throne was based on invalidating their brother Edward V. If the boys had no right to inherit, then neither did the girls. Caxton's dedication, though anonymous, subtly contradicted this judgment. By describing the unnamed lady, her husband Edward IV, and their daughters as noble, Caxton implicitly extended this nobility to the princes as well. The anonymity was deliberate, but the phrase, "her good grace," left little doubt about the Queen's identity. The fact that Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were meant is underscored by the very book to which the prologue was attached. The Book of the Knight of the Tower. The title does not actually refer to the Tower of London. The original author was a real knight who, in 14th century France, composed the work as a guide for his daughters. Elizabeth Woodville, who had many daughters of her own, some already of marriageable age, was understandably interested in such a book. Yet the events of 1483 gave the title a new and bitter resonance. When Caxton completed his translation on the 1st of June, Edward V was still in the Tower of London, and the entire fate of the Queen's family depended on his survival. By the time the book went to press in January 1484, those hopes had collapsed. In the text of the prologue, Caxton's concern for his patroness is plain. He not only promises to pray for her, but expresses his wish that she may reign in heaven when God calls her to himself. Caxton clearly assumed his readers would know who he meant, and he urged them to thank the lady and pray for her as well. The question remains whether Caxton wrote these lines entirely on his own initiative or at Elizabeth Woodville's request. He was not an obvious opponent of Richard III, indeed he had also dedicated works to him, so he was not courting open confrontation. I suspect that the prologue was coordinated with Elizabeth herself. It upheld the honor of her family, subtly yet unmistakably, while being worded in a way that remained safe for the printer. Elizabeth Woodville's concern in the text is visibly directed toward her daughters, yet the fate of her sons was unmistakably echoed in the very title of the book. In my opinion, both the dates and the language of the prologue are too precise to be dismissed as mere coincidence. What this still does not answer is whether Elizabeth Woodville herself believed the princes were dead. Caxton's emphasis on daughters cannot be used to interpret this question, given the nature of the book. Under Henry VII, however, the matter was quickly clarified. And this also gives me the chance to dispel a persistent rumor that Henry VII or his Parliament never accused Richard of murdering the princes in the Tower. In the very first Parliament, we find a statement that Richard had shed the blood of infants among other crimes. In the past, some have debated whether this truly referred to the princes. But how much does it help Richard's reputation to suggest that it might have meant other infants who vanished during his reign? In fact, this is the only specific clarification among all the charges, which otherwise consisted of conspiracies, treason, and other misdeeds. For the crime of murder, Parliament singled out the shedding of infants' blood. Henry's courts subsequently treated the princes as dead. I show here a source dated the 27th of November 1489, which records this verbatim with regard to Richard of Shrewsbury. The text goes on to state that Henry's first Parliament had subsequently taken action against John Howard. Thus, we have judicial confirmation that Henry's government already assumed, prior to the first Parliament, that Richard of Shrewsbury was dead. In Parliament, Richard of Gloucester was indicted for the murder of infants. Taken together, the evidence is clear. To our knowledge, Elizabeth Woodville never publicly contradicted this conclusion. That does not mean she personally believed it, but she lived in a world where her sons were regarded as dead, and nothing in her public actions gives reason to think otherwise. The title of Caxton's book also leads us back to a subject I briefly touched on at the beginning: the Tower of London. Elizabeth Woodville's attitude toward the fortress is striking. At first, it was a place of triumph for her. She spent time there before her coronation, one of the greatest moments of her life. But afterward, the tower became for her a place of dread. This was already evident under Richard III. When surrendering her daughters, Elizabeth made it a condition that the king swear an oath that they would not be taken to the tower. Richard agreed. Later, when she chose a place for her retirement, she deliberately settled where she could see the fortress every day. Yet a return inside its walls was unthinkable. This became especially clear when Elizabeth of York, following tradition, stayed at the tower before her coronation. The presence of her mother was expected and even desired. Yet Elizabeth Woodville refused to attend. To her, the tower was no longer a place she could set foot in. In this regard, 3 points deserve attention. First, during the late Middle Ages, the culture of commemorating the dead became increasingly individualized. When no grave was available, places tied to the deceased's life often served as memorials. No place was more closely linked with Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury than the fortress where they vanished. Second, Elizabeth Woodville entered retirement only after her family's affairs were largely settled. The legal status of her and her daughters had been restored. Elizabeth of York was securely married to the new king. Some sisters were already wed, and Henry's queen took responsibility for arranging marriages for the rest. Her youngest daughter, Bridget, was safely in a convent, and Elizabeth of York sent her small sums of money there. Thomas Grey had long been married to Cecily Bonville and fathered 15 children, 11 or 12 of whom reached adulthood. Richard Grey, executed in 1483, was buried at Pontefract. With the exception of the princes, Elizabeth Woodville knew the fate of all her children, or else saw them placed in secure hands. Her decision to live within sight of the tower, then, seems a deliberate act of remembrance. Third, I believe the daily sight of the tower also carried the meaning of self-imposed penance. Elizabeth Woodville had always gone into survival mode in times of crisis, doing everything possible to protect her family. Yet she had failed 3 times, first with Richard Grey, and then with her 2 younger sons. Her eldest son, by her first marriage, had already been grown. The princes were still children. It was she who had written to Edward V, urging him to accept a smaller escort for his entry into London. That decision made it easy for Richard III and Buckingham to overwhelm the Woodville forces. It was also Elizabeth Woodville who entrusted Richard of Shrewsbury to her brother-in-law's custody. A sense of guilt would be understandable, and this guilt would weigh on her even if we assume that Richard III did not murder the princes, but instead had them hidden away. They still lost everything: their names, their possessions, their family, and their identity. Even if you believe that the boys survived, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, as the rightful sons of Edward IV, died in that tower. Elizabeth Woodville's conspicuous behavior regarding the tower is, to me, the first major argument that she believed her sons were dead and that she probably held Richard III responsible. The fate of Richard Grey illustrates why. The Lord Protector seized the estates of the former Queen's second son weeks before his execution without any legal process. The beheading itself took place without trial. From this example alone, Elizabeth Woodville had proof that Richard III was willing to murder her sons. Her role at Arthur's baptism in the autumn of 1486 forms the second argument. The ceremony took place on the 24th of September in Winchester Cathedral, a place associated with the legendary Camelot during that time. The event cast the House of York into the centre of attention. Margaret Beaufort herself was not present. Elizabeth Woodville, however, served as one of the child's godmothers. At her side was her second eldest daughter, Cecily, who, notably, enjoyed an excellent relationship with Margaret Beaufort. Elizabeth carried Arthur to the altar. This was more than a gesture of honour. It was an act of performative legitimation. The House of York was transferring its claim to the throne into the hands of the new Tudor dynasty. At the same time, the symbolism was one of reconciliation. Arthur, embodying the union of York and Lancaster, was meant to bring the Wars of the Roses to a close. Yet he also stood in place of the missing princes. He was to become Prince of Wales, the successor to Edward V, and in time king, thereby taking the role that should have been Edward's. And he was the godson of the prince's own mother. In Arthur, the lost boys were replaced. Elizabeth Woodville's active role in the baptism made this message unmistakable. Her participation was all the more significant when contrasted with her conspicuous absences elsewhere. Her refusal to take part in Elizabeth of York's coronation festivities and the omission of Henry's name from her will. Both show she had the freedom to withhold her presence when she wished. That she embraced Arthur's baptism so publicly signals her approval. Taken together, Arthur's baptism is a strong indication that Elizabeth Woodville believed her two youngest sons were dead, and that she did not hold the Tudors responsible for their fate. Yet the absence of a formal commemoration of the princes is a powerful counterargument. For all the private devotion Elizabeth Woodville may have practiced, and for all the endowments arranged in Edward IV's lifetime, no public memoria for her sons is known until the 16th century. In principle, this is striking. Memoria was a profoundly social act, a gathering of the Christian community to provide comfort and mutual strength in the face of loss. From a devout woman such as Elizabeth Woodville, one would naturally expect such a public commemoration, and there is evidence it was possible. Edward V appears in the first epitaph of Elizabeth of York. Legally, the princes were already regarded as dead. Some historians have suggested that the Tudors preferred to direct public attention toward the heirs of the new dynasty. That is certainly true, but it does not preclude memorializing the lost princes. After all, Henry VII himself paid for a new burial site for Richard III. Why then was there no real social commemoration for the princes? I cannot give a definitive answer. Perhaps Elizabeth Woodville herself opposed it. Perhaps other factors intervened. We can only speculate, and such speculation lacks firm ground. For that reason, my advice to Ricardians who wish to challenge the view that the princes perished is this: ask why their memoria never took place. In light of the absence of any public commemoration of the princes, and my inability to explain this circumstance, what follows can only be presented as my own conclusion, not as an indisputable fact. I believe that Elizabeth Woodville regarded her sons as dead, at the latest, after the collapse of Buckingham's rebellion, and she likely believed Richard III to be the man who had ordered their deaths. From the summer of 1483 onward, she was a mother in survival mode. Once she had secured the safety of her remaining family, she withdrew into seclusion at a place that allowed her to live in quiet devotion within sight of what she must have considered the burial place of her sons. There she prayed for their salvation and for her own. As always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.